Parasites are everywhere in dark fantasy. Infected blood, sacred insects, corrupted roots, living diseases, divine organisms feeding through bodies, kingdoms, and entire ecosystems. And that is not an accident, because parasites are one of the few forms of life that are horrifying at every scale. They are terrifying inside the body, they are terrifying inside society, and they are terrifying inside religion. A parasite does not simply destroy you. It enters, it feeds, it changes your behavior, it changes your purpose. And sometimes, worst of all, it keeps you alive while doing it. That is why parasites rule dark fantasy worlds. Not because they are disgusting, but because they are the perfect biological image of a world where nothing remains purely your own. Dark fantasy is obsessed with invasion, not just armies invading kingdoms, not just gods invading history, but something more intimate than that. Bodies invaded by fluids, minds invaded by voices, landscapes invaded by rot, civilizations invaded by sacred systems they can no longer control. And parasites sit at the center of all of it, because a parasite is never just a monster. It is a living structure of dependence, intrusion, and transformation. It crosses boundaries that ordinary predators do not. It does not merely hunt from outside. It lives through the host. It borrows the host. It may even need the host to continue itself. That makes it uniquely powerful in storytelling. So in this video, I want to explore why parasites dominate dark fantasy worlds, and why they keep appearing in stories about corruption, divinity, false healing, sacred blood, and biological horror. The answer is simple. Parasites are the perfect symbol of stolen life. Section 1. Parasites destroy the idea of a closed self. One of the deepest fears in dark fantasy is the collapse of bodily sovereignty. The fear that your body is not really yours. That something can enter it, use it, redirect it, and make your survival serve another purpose. Parasites express that fear more precisely than almost any other creature. A predator kills from outside. A parasite survives from within. That difference matters. Predation is violent but clear. The threat is visible. The enemy is separate from the self. Parasitism is more disturbing because it confuses the boundary. Where do you end? Where does the invader begin? At what point does damage become coexistence? At what point does coexistence become control? This is why parasite imagery is so powerful in dark fantasy. It turns a body into contested territory, not a secure identity, but a habitat, a vessel, a site of biological negotiation. And once the body becomes a habitat, the self becomes unstable. That instability is the foundation of body horror, sacred corruption, and false transformation across the genre. Because the parasite's greatest power is not that it kills. It is that it makes the host participate in its own undoing. Section 2. Parasites are the perfect image of corruption. Dark fantasy rarely treats corruption as simple dirt or decay. Corruption is usually active, organized, spreading, adaptive. It behaves like life. And that is exactly why parasites fit so well. A parasite is corruption with intent. It does not merely stain the world. It establishes itself inside the structures the world already depends on. Bloodstreams, roots, fates, dynasties, lineages, sacred rituals. That is what makes parasitism so narratively useful. It allows corruption to feel intimate and systemic at the same time. A cursed king may carry corruption in his blood. A holy church may unknowingly worship a parasitic force. A kingdom may think it is being blessed while it is actually being colonized from the inside. And all of these ideas share the same structure. Something foreign enters a living order, and then begins to use that order to reproduce itself. That is not just decay, that is occupation. Parasites rule dark fantasy because they make corruption feel alive enough to have strategy. Section 3. Parasites turn healing into horror. Parasites are especially effective in dark fantasy because they corrupt one of the most sacred ideas in fantasy storytelling: healing. Healing is supposed to mean restoration, wholeness, return, the body recovering its rightful order. But parasites distort that promise, because parasites often preserve before they destroy. They maintain function, delay collapse, support the host just enough to keep the system going, not out of mercy, but out of utility. This is where false healing enters the genre. A body continues, but not on its own terms. A wound closes, but under the influence of something foreign. A holy fluid grants vitality, but only by making the organism dependent on an outside order of life. That is why parasitic logic appears so often in stories about sacred blood, divine nectar, rot, blessing, and cursed immortality. Because the parasite transforms healing into a bargain. You may survive, but survival will no longer belong entirely to you. And that is much more disturbing than ordinary disease. Disease simply threatens life. Parasitic healing threatens the meaning of life. Section 4. Parasites scale from body horror to world horror. Most monsters are limited by scale. Some are terrifying close-up, but less interesting at the level of kingdoms. Others are terrifying at mythic scale, but too abstract to feel intimate. Parasites do something rare. They work at every level at once. At the smallest scale, they infect tissue, blood, nerves, and instinct. At the human scale, they alter identity, behavior, and survival. At the social scale, they spread through institutions, rituals, inheritance, and power. And at the environmental scale, they reshape landscapes into systems that favor their continued reproduction. This makes them ideal for dark fantasy world building. A parasite can be a creature, a religion, a bloodline, a ritual economy, a divine ecology, or an entire worldview disguised as salvation. That flexibility is why parasitic imagery keeps returning in dark worlds. It can explain the corruption of a single body and the corruption of a civilization, using the exact same logic. In other words, parasites do not just create body horror. They create continuity between body horror and cosmic horror. They show how invasion scales. Section 5. Parasites and the horror of divinity. Dark fantasy gods are rarely distant abstractions. They bleed, they infect, they reproduce, they mark bodies, they claim bloodlines, they demand vessels. And this is exactly where parasitic logic becomes divine logic, because a parasitic god is not merely worshipped. It lives through the worshiper. It may require carriers, hosts, chosen lineages, transformed saints, infected pilgrims, or sacred fluids that transmit its influence. That is one of the most disturbing possibilities in dark fantasy. Not that the divine exists above life, but that the divine behaves like a superior form of parasitism, a god that enters rather than descends, a god that spreads rather than appears, a god that inhabits flesh instead of transcending it. Once divinity takes this form, worship becomes biologically dangerous. Faith is no longer just obedience. It becomes exposure. Blessing becomes colonization. Communion becomes transmission. Transformation becomes loss of sovereignty. That is why parasites rule dark fantasy religions, because they turn holiness into a biological event. Section 6. Why parasites feel smarter than monsters. Another reason parasites dominate dark fantasy is that they feel more intelligent than brute monsters, even when they are not literally intelligent. A brute force creature destroys by appetite. A parasite feels different. It feels patient, selective, embedded, almost strategic. Even when acting through instinct, parasitic behavior looks like planning. It identifies entry points, uses existing systems, avoids open confrontation when possible, spreads invisibly before it becomes undeniable. That pattern maps perfectly onto dark fantasy themes of conspiracy, curse, heresy, bloodline decay, sacred corruption, and hidden rot beneath civilization. Parasites make worlds feel compromised before they make them feel ruined. And that is much scarier, because open catastrophe can be fought. But hidden occupation changes the rules before anyone realizes the war has started. This is why so many dark fantasy settings feel parasitic even when no literal parasite is shown. The logic is still there. A kingdom feeding on its people, a church feeding on devotion, a bloodline feeding on heirs, an immortal order feeding on the bodies of the living. Parasitism becomes a structure, not just a species. Section 7. Parasites make transformation feel profane. Fantasy often loves transformation, ascension, evolution, metamorphosis, becoming more than mortal. Dark fantasy asks a crueler question. What if transformation is not liberation? What if it is capture? Parasites are essential to this question because they make change feel involuntary, intimate, and exploitative. The host does not rise into a higher state through self-mastery. The host is repurposed. Its body becomes useful to another life cycle. Its identity becomes secondary to another system's reproduction. Its new form may even look sacred, evolved, or beautiful, while being fundamentally dispossessing. This is where parasitism becomes one of the genre's greatest tools. It lets dark fantasy depict transformation as theft, not self-becoming, but self-loss disguised as becoming. And that is why parasite imagery pairs so naturally with flowers, cocoons, holy blood, divine insects, roots, eggs, and glowing fluids. These are all beautiful forms. Parasitism turns them into traps. Section 8. Parasites explain why dark fantasy worlds feel alive. Dark fantasy worlds do not feel frightening simply because they are violent. They feel frightening because their horrors seem ecological. They have cycles, pressures, systems of spread, visible symptoms, and hidden causes. Parasites help create that feeling, because a world shaped by parasitic logic does not feel randomly cursed. It feels biologically occupied. Bodies are not merely wounded. They are used. Landscapes are not merely ruined. They are converted. Religions are not merely false. They are transmissive. Kingdoms are not merely dying. They are feeding something. This gives dark fantasy the sense of dreadful coherence. Everything connects. The womb connects to the ritual. The ritual connects to the bloodline. The bloodline connects to the land. The land connects to the god. And parasitism is the mechanism that makes those links feel believable. It provides a living logic of corruption. That is why parasites do not just populate dark fantasy worlds. They organize them. So why do parasites rule dark fantasy worlds? Because few things express the genre's deepest fears more completely. They violate the body. They confuse the self. They turn healing into dependence. They turn holiness into transmission. They turn transformation into theft. And they allow corruption to spread with the logic of life itself. A parasite is not just a creature. It is a structure of invasion. A way of imagining a world where survival is never neutral, where blessings can colonize, where beauty can feed, and where even the sacred may need a host. That is why parasites return again and again in dark fantasy. Not because they are merely gross, not because they are easy monsters, but because they reveal a truth the genre is built on. The most terrifying evil is not the one that kills from outside. It is the one that enters, lives through you, and calls that relationship salvation. If you want, next we can explore the biology of Bloodborne's great ones. The void might be alive, or the horror of divine infection.